Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Dill, a lot of talk, a lot of noise on Twitter, on the message boards, in the college football landscape about Dan Lanning and the Oregon Ducks, and can they develop talent at the necessary level? And I think a lot of people look at this and say, all right, Oregon uses the transfer portal so much, that tells us they can't develop the high school talent. I look at it and say, one, that this is a very early conversation to have with Dan Lanning. I think it's important to remind people that he's only going into year 4. He just finished up year 3 as the head coach of this Oregon Ducks program. But I think, secondly, I think a lot of people are ignoring the success that Dan Lanning has had over the last couple of years with talent development. And I think, one, it plays itself out on the football field. This is an Oregon team that has gotten better every single year Dan Lanning has been there. I think more importantly, look at as this NFL draft process plays out, you had a record-breaking number of Oregon players get invited to the NFL Combine. That number was 12. The previous record was 7. And so you talk about player development. This is kind of a perfect time to talk about this conversation about talent development in Eugene, Oregon. Want to get into it from a couple of different angles. Dill, one, let's look at the high school talent that Dan Lanning has developed. Let's look at the transfer portal additions that Dan Lanning has made over the last couple of years. Guys that were solid football players, but came to Eugene and got better as football players. And then let's take a look at this roster going into 2026 and say, or 2025, and say, hey, how much NFL draft talent do we have on this roster going into the 2025 year? Before we do it, as always, y'all let it fly in the comment section. Dill, it got heated between us before we even went live, and it might get heated for the next 10 to 15 minutes. Y'all let it fly in the comment section. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, subscribing to the channel. Dill, without further ado, let's start with the high school development, which, again, I feel like is so early to have this conversation because you look at the guys like Josh Connerly, who's probably going to be a top 15 pick, a guy like Jordan James as well. That was the freshman class that Dan Lanning had when he got to Eugene. When you look at the high school development, the guys that have come to Oregon over the last couple of years through the high school ranks, what kind of stands out to you the most about that kind of talent getting developed?
I mean, it probably starts like, does it really feel like an issue? I mean, you look like Josh Connerly being part of that Oregon class, developing him into a pretty much what I would think is going to be a first round offensive
Yes.
tackle. Guys like Jordan James and Ferguson, like you can say Ferguson wasn't Lanning's recruit, but he built himself up under Lanning's
Yeah.
program. So I look like, again, there's certainly positions maybe you can question. Like, I know they have been a little heavy on the portal in the offensive line, for example. Again, that's a unit that takes, I feel like, years to build out the pipeline. You probably need it, and he just hasn't had that time. But look, like when you look at the combine, I think it's a good mix of guys that I would call are more Dan Lanning in this Oregon programs, like the guys they've
Yep.
developed, but also like what you said, like guys who have come to this program from the portal and have really elevated themselves. Because I think you want to be able to show that you can do both. You don't want to just be so
100%.
reliant.
When you're going out to the transfer portal and trying to get the top players in the portal, if you have a sample size of guys, hey, you come to Eugene, you get better as a football player, go to the NFL draft. That's important too, and we're going to get into that. That's probably the most successful part about this Oregon program right now is they are taking players from the transfer portal, getting them better as football players. Another guy I would throw in there, Jeff Bossum. He played safety in 2021 before Dan Lanning got there, kicked down to off-ball linebacker, has been a stalwart for them over the last couple of years. This is where I think the conversation gets fun. Portal players getting better. Let's take a look at just this year. I mean, Derek Carman was very solid. We knew him quite well coming over from Michigan State. He turned into one of the most disruptive, dominant defensive linemen you saw in the sport. I mean, the numbers bear it out too. He had 4 tackles for loss and 1.5 sacks at Michigan State in 2023. 11 tackles for loss, 5 sacks, 43 quarterback hurries, which was top 5 for defensive linemen in the country in 2024. Dill, let's take a look at Tez Johnson, who's probably generating the most amount of buzz. Tez Johnson was ranked as the 80th wide receiver in the transfer portal in the 2023 class. He comes to Oregon, has been one of the most productive and dynamic wide receivers that we see across the country. There's plenty of examples of guys that, were solid football players in the transfer portal, but they come to Oregon and they explode onto the scene.
I mean, you probably should throw like Jordan Birch and Jamari Caldwell in. Like Jordan Birch, especially. I mean, a guy who was like almost like thought to be like a 5-star bust, if you will, coming out of South Carolina.
Agreed.
Like, oh, he's fine. He is what he is. He's played okay football. Like, you're not going to complain about him as a starter, but he's certainly not really an impact guy. Comes over to Oregon, especially in 2023, has a huge year. And you look again, another guy who's probably vaulted himself into that day two, maybe day two conversation, probably
Yes.
not be a day one pick, but he'll probably be in that day two world. And you look like, again, I think you want to be able to sell both avenues, if you will, because I do think like you can't just totally fill your team with high school talent at this point and be what I think you want to be. I think you do need to be able to do both, and their ability to, again, take those guys who, again, are probably into their last 1 or 2 years of college football and say, like, look, you come here, we
And
can take you
elevate.
from a day three pick to a day one or a day two pick. Like, yeah, that's crucial to, I think, success in this era of college football.
Yeah, and I'll say this about Tez Johnson real quick: the 4.5 in the 40 was and look. So I'm gonna be quite frank about it. It was slower than I thought it was gonna be. Is that a massive concern for me? No. Dill, name me a time where we saw Tez Johnson get caught from behind one time in Eugene, Oregon over the last 2 years. You can't find that. And then secondly, like Tez Johnson, it sets up perfectly for those NFL draft experts on Twitter. He's the first one in NFL combine history to weigh less than 170 pounds and not go sub 4.5. Look, what is Tez Johnson great at anyways? It's not the straight line speed. Yeah, he's fast and it's football speed. He's got football speed. That's plenty of that. But Dill, we know what makes Tez Johnson great. That's the short area quicks, the ability to separate, the ability to make people miss.
But
I think
also
people
the
are making
understanding how to play that slot wide receiver
yeah,
positioning, like being able to find holes in the zone. It's like, again, like those things that you saw at Oregon. It wasn't exactly like his game was predicated on the verticality, and he did show more of that this year, which I think was like good for him in a certain respect. But you go back to like 2023, I mean, it was all working underneath. I think 24, with him being more of the guy, if you will, you started to see them use him a little bit more down the field. And again, he made it happen. He was able to hit those plays against teams like Ohio State and Penn State, like teams with NFL level defensive backs. So yeah, I mean, people are going to make a deal of it's like combine season.
and
It's
it's
slow for
and it
everyone.
is like, let's be frank, is it a little concerning 154 pounds? Yeah, definitely, maybe. But like, just turn this kid to turn the film on for this kid, and you don't have any more concerns. I mean, same people were talking about Devontae Smith or a guy like Tank Dell like this too. They're doing more than fine in the NFL. I think this conversation is worth going back over the last couple of years too. Bo Nix, like Bo Nix took massive steps when he got to Oregon. I mean, people talk about 5-star bust. That's why people were talking about him at Auburn. Comes to Oregon, Heisman caliber quarterback. Dylan Gabriel was not a bust by any means, but he took some steps. The way people are talking about Dylan Gabriel as an NFL draft prospect versus 12 months ago, it's different, Dill. It's different. What about a guy like Christian Gonzalez? Or get rest in peace, Kyrie Jackson, another good example of that. There's examples all over the place of them taking guys in the transfer portal and getting them better as football players. And I don't get why that doesn't get included when you're talking about player development, because that stuff matters as
Well,
well.
and that's
Let's
where, again, like if that's all they were showing, I'd be frankly a little bit concerned because, again, I think you need to have both paths open to you. I think the bulk of your team, you'd certainly want it to be built by high school players that are there for
agree.
3 or 4 years and that you develop. Again, you've seen guys for Oregon be those guys, the Connor Lees, the T. Fergs, the Jordan James. Like it's not like there are no examples of those. Mateo, you, and obviously Tatum, like those guys are coming along the way you want them to. But yeah, I think it is an important, like, you want to be a place where portal guys can take the step or make the
Yeah,
jump. It's certainly a
100%.
part of the game now.
I think it's also worth mentioning, we're talking about high school talent. Dan Lanning's recruiting at a different level than he did when he came in. Like, I believe it was around 10 when he came in. Now it's consistently top 5, the number 2 class in 2025. So not only do we think the player development is coming along, but they'll, like, when you start grabbing better and better players, the player development is going to look better and better as well. Big storylines here in terms of next year's NFL draft talent. I'll start at the top of the quarterback spot. I mean, this is a very, very good trend that Oregon's having, right? You have a ton of success with Bo Nix. No doubt that's why Dylan Gabriel came to Oregon, and no doubt why Dante Moore came back to Oregon as well. If Dante Moore can be the guy that we all think he is and goes out and balls out in the 2025 year, that narrative around Oregon in quarterback development is only going to get stronger. And that's something that Oregon never really had under Mario Cristobal. They could go get some quarterbacks, but it never really was a spot where it's like, hey, if you're Jared Curtis in the 2026 class, you're the best quarterback in the country. Where do I go to get the proper development I need? Historically, it hasn't been like you got to take a look at Oregon. Now it's like if you're an elite quarterback and you want to get developed to the next level, you have to take a look at Oregon because of what they did with guys like Bo Nix and Dylan Gabriel and potentially Dante Moore in the 2025 year as well.
And they're putting the team around it too. I mean, you see them.
Yeah.
They always have top end talent. Like again, whether they have to go to the portal and get really good players to subvert fill in spots that they're light, they'll do it. So I think you look, it's not a team that if I'm a quarterback, I look at and say, oh, this isn't going to have the talent I need to be able to put the numbers up I want to put up. Like they're going to be talented, whether they do it through high school, whether they supplement it through the portal. Like they have both avenues, I feel like firing. So it's not a program you got to worry about. Like, oh, if I go here, I'll have to deal with
Yeah.
like what Bo Nix dealt with, where they just weren't good enough around him. It was
One other thing I'll note is, all right, like take a look at Dan Lanning's first real class, the guys who are going into their junior year. Kenny Sadiq, very good chance he's the best tight end in the country in 2025. Poncho at center. Dill, how many better centers do you see than Poncho across the country? Not many, if any. And so, like, you're starting to see it, and it might not necessarily show in this year's NFL draft class, but it's going to show down the road. Then you go over to the defense. Well, let's talk about one of the areas of concern, Dill. I think that's because, look, we're getting up here, and we're not going to just say Oregon's perfect because there are certain spots where you want to see it get better. I would point to the offensive line. And I think a lot of Oregon fans probably agree with this too, where Dan Lanning, you're going into year 4. Do you want to have to be relying on grabbing 3 elite offensive linemen in the portal? Probably not, because it's something that's hard to replicate every single year. Dan Lanning was able to do it going into 2025, but it's not something you want to rely on. Does the offensive line stand out to you as potentially a concern in terms of that player development category?
Honestly, I think my bigger issue is probably just simply recruiting. It hasn't been a
Yeah.
position that in at least until the last maybe 2 cycles. Like again, you see Zaire Addison, Douglas Utu, like that's the class you kind
That's
of
what it
want.
needs to look
The
like.
kid from Washington, Zach. I'm blanking on the last name, but like you need more of those type of players in your high school classes
Yeah.
because again, like they're developing the good players that come through this program. Like Josh Connerly, really big time recruit, really big time results in the field. Poncho, like he's a guy who does feel like he's coming along in playing good football for them. They just, to be very frank, they haven't had enough talent come into the doors. Like the
I
last
probably
couple
agree with
cycles,
that.
I think they're building the pipeline
And
up. And
Dylan, you know who I think also agrees with that? Sorry to cut you off. That you can ding me on that. Dan Lanning is seeing it too. I think
they
Dan
pushed
Lanning's
harder
agreeing with
this
you.
class for sure.
Who's he going after in this 2026 class? Who are the top targets on the board? Yeah, Jared Curtis at
Well,
quarterback. It's Jackson Campbell and Emmanuel Achano, two of the better offensive tackles that I've seen coming out of high school in a really long time. On the defensive side of the football, look, I really don't think the player development's been all that bad. Like, look, Mateo, Tatum, they're going to be, if they want to go to the NFL after this year, they will be going to the NFL. Amari Washington, another really good example of that. But I will say this. This is where if Oregon wants to take that next step, this is where it needs to happen. Because look at the past, and Oregon fans, y'all have heard me talk about this. Look at the past 4 national champs. Georgia in 2021, Georgia in 2022, Michigan in 2023, and Ohio State in 2024. Those were all really good teams, but Dill, where was the strength of all those teams? And when I say strengths, where were they elite at?
They were
On the
both
defensive
had
line.
great D lines.
Has
Georgia
Oregon been that elite defensive line under Dan Lanning yet? I'd argue no. Have they gotten better on the defensive line?
because like last year they were kind of in the picture. I mean, that was a really good defense. It probably wasn't as deep as you would have wanted it, but like
I
their
could read
top
the
end was
numbers.
what you were looking
I
for.
could read you the numbers, and they were surprisingly not as good. 4.6 yards per carry allowed. That was 62nd in the country. They only sacked the quarterback 27th most in the country. So it's like they were good. And those aren't bad numbers. There's a lot of college football fans listening that would take it. But is that national? Because then you look at what Michigan did in 2023. Ohio State was the number 1 team sacking the quarterback. Georgia was in 2021 and 2022. Are we elite there? That's where
This is going to be one of those ones
this is
like
the
you
year.
need an Aiden Breland or a Jarrett. Like you need to see something from those younger players. And I look, that's another. I think in the secondary is the other spot I'm looking like. I'm a little disappointed that some of their young guys couldn't get on the field a little more last year because it didn't feel like even the
Mm,
portal guys aside from Jabbar Muhammad that you brought in,
the
like they
safeties, yeah.
weren't big time players like Tasheem Johnson, Kobe Savage, like those guys just aren't guys like you knew they weren't going to be like big time pros. They just didn't have that in them. It didn't matter what
Yep.
Oregon did with them in terms of development. They just didn't have that talent level.
But
The
now,
secondary spot I'm looking at, I really want to see those young guys. I want to see them
yeah,
on the
and
field,
I
and I
think
want to
it's
see them playing
I
well.
think you're probably being a little unfair. This was part of like the boys are tame right now. It was not tame 30 minutes ago. Dill, all these guys that you're pointing at, they were true freshmen last year. I mean, Ifio, Peyton Woodyard, Aaron Flowers, Kingston Lopez, Dakota Fields, they were all freshman guys. And that was one of those positions that you knew probably just wasn't good enough. And they tried to go to the transfer portal. And this is kind of the definition of you can't use the transfer portal purely to build national championship team because you look at the secondary, say it wasn't quite national championship caliber. There's a really good chance that in 2025, and I'm agreeing with you, it's a big year for the development of a guy like Iffy, a guy like Kingston Lopa, Peyton Woodyard, Aaron Flowers, Dakota Fields, Roderick Pleasant. They got the talent in now. They've done a good enough job recruiting the high school ranks. Now you got to see these guys take a step very similar to that defensive line where
See,
you have
that's
guys.
almost like I wish you could have pulled some of that development forward a little bit. And again, like they are young players, so it's like it is what it is.
Yeah, they're
But
all
just
freshmen.
given the level they were at in the secondary, and like when you saw like teams get going on them, like Ohio State, even Penn State, like was
Yeah.
throwing for more yards than I think you'd want to see. Obviously, Penn State more running, but like they did have some teams throw the ball on them a little bit like more effectively than I would have wanted. That to me was probably the bigger area of concern because like defensive line, I didn't necessarily expect to see their young guys playing a ton because like were you really going to take the
But
guys
what
like
one
Marcus
guys were you
Wilson?
looking for to step up last year? Because I don't know, like most of them, Jaleel Florence was a guy, but he was dealing with an injury, and Dante Manning was solid. This is the year where again,
That's the issue though. There
this
was
is
too much solid. There wasn't enough like
yeah, but
I
that
can point to
my
that. That's NFL level.
like
Like there
my
wasn't a ton
point
of
here is that it was too early in the Dan Lanning tenure to say like, hey, he's not doing a good enough job. What did you want? All these true freshmen to come in and be all Americans? This
but
is
yeah,
the
but you would have liked to see some of like the guys from 22 or 23. And I know they didn't bring in as big time a class if you
no,
will
they're
as
not
they
even
did in
close.
24.
There's levels.
But still, you'd like to even like a Roderick Pleasant, would you like to see him be able to make more of an impact when
Yeah,
I'm watching
Brandon
guys like what
Johnson.
we were watching, like
Yeah.
getting dusted at times by the
Man,
veterans?
dusted is strong word.
Well,
I
like Ohio
I
State
agree where
was
you're
like
coming
really
from, and
just
look,
running them off the ball there.
you're being nitpicky because you know what the standard is now, and that's
You have to be
national.
though.
Yeah,
If
I
Dan
agree.
Lanning's gonna be like what I think he can be, yeah, it has to be a little nitpicky because again, he's gotten this team to a place where they're national championship ready. Now, what gets them over the hump?
Is
I don't think you want to see good wide receiver units be almost feel unguardable. And at times, Ohio State in
yeah,
both games felt closer to unguardable for Oregon than I would have wanted to see.
yeah, that's fair. I guess what we're getting on here is just like the kind of we were kind of bouncing around, but it's like you can use this time period now to really assess what player development looks like. And at the end of the day, to me, I'm seeing so much of this narrative of Dan Lanning can't develop.
Well,
And it's
that
like,
is like on its surface, just like stupid. Like to say like he
yeah,
can't develop talent because it's like again when you watch them take the leaps and bounds improvements, like what they looked like against Georgia in year one to what they look like this
that's
year.
a great
It's like
example.
I
Great
mean,
example.
like even Kirby Smart's like this isn't a
Yeah,
talented team. Like Dan Lanning's a good coach, but these guys are what they are. They're a team that now physically at least
yeah,
looks the part against anyone they play. I mean,
I
there's
agree.
not teams that I look like, oh, yeah, they're just going to run
Yeah,
off the ball.
even in that Ohio State game, it's like 2 months ago we saw them win that football game, and then
Exactly.
it's like they came out flat and it was really ugly, and that's where like this conversation is coming from. I feel like we were cherry picking one game. If you told me Dan, if you told me Oregon won the national championship in 2024, I would not be surprised. They just played a really bad football game when Ohio State was playing really good, and that's kind of the results you get. We'll sign out there. Appreciate you guys rocking with it, kind of all over the place. A little bit of a more an open-ended conversation. Would love to hear from y'all. Appreciate you guys. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later.